My brother's fiancée is jealous of me. Then she laughed at the fact that I lost my family member. Later, she even tried to push me out of her own family. My younger brother Zach is getting married to a girl named Kelly, and at 25, he's probably the most earnest person I know, always the kind to believe in people until they give him a reason not to. Kelly is 24, and from the beginning, there was something about her story that tugged at everyone's heart. She doesn't have any family. No parents, no siblings, no distant aunts or uncles, not even a grandparent she keeps in touch with. Just her on her own. And because of that, my parents, who have always been generous to a fault, made it their personal mission to make her feel welcomed and embraced as one of us. My mom started referring to her as our future daughter within a week of Zach's proposal, and my dad, who's usually more reserved, even offered to walk her down the aisle if she wanted. It felt like everyone was so eager to fold her into the family, to give her the kind of belonging she'd supposedly never had, that we never stopped to really look too closely at anything else. At first, I'll admit I liked her. She was polite, soft-spoken, and made a point to thank everyone for even the smallest gestures. She'd show up to family dinners with a bottle of wine and a practiced smile, compliment my mom's cooking, laugh at my dad's corny jokes, and even asked about my work the first time we met. She seemed perfect, maybe too perfect. But it wasn't until I started seeing her more often, watching how she moved through different situations, that something in her behavior started to unsettle me. It wasn't anything glaring or dramatic. It was subtle, like a whisper behind her words, or the way her eyes would sometimes go distant when people shared stories about their childhoods. There was a stiffness to her when we talked about things like traditions or inside jokes, like she was performing warmth instead of feeling it. And maybe that would have been fine, understandable even if it stopped there. But slowly, the strange moments started stacking up, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the version of Kelly we were seeing wasn't entirely real. I'm Haley, 27 years old, and for the past several years, my life has been centered far from the town I grew up in. I live about 5 hours away now, not because I wanted to run from anything, but because of someone who changed the entire course of my life, Mrs. Grace. She was 98 when she passed, and I had worked as her personal nurse for almost 6 years. What started as a job quietly evolved into something much deeper. She became like a grandmother to me, though she had no biological connection and no family left of her own. She was sharp as a tack and had this dry sense of humor that took a minute to catch, but once you did, it left you laughing for days. In those long afternoons between medications and checkups, we'd talk about everything: her youth, my hopes, the things we both regretted. She helped me in ways I never expected. When I confided in her about wanting to go back to school to pursue a second degree, she didn't hesitate. She offered to cover the tuition herself, saying it was her investment in someone who had brought meaning back into her life. I cried the first time she handed me a check, not because of the money, but because it was the first time in a long while that someone believed in me so completely. We became inseparable in those final years. I wasn't just her nurse, I was her companion, her confidant, her family in every way that mattered. So while I stayed physically distant from my hometown and the usual rhythms of family life, I was rooted in something real and full of love. Being away from home didn't mean I wasn't building something meaningful. It just looked different than anyone expected. At our very first meeting, Callie smiled in that overly polished way and said she'd heard all about me in family conversations, as if I were some mysterious legend they all whispered about. It was meant to be flattering, I think, but the way she said it gave me pause, like there was more weight behind the words than she wanted me to notice. From that moment on, something shifted. It was like she had decided I was her personal project, or perhaps her competition. I couldn't quite tell which. At every family gathering after that, no matter who I was talking to or what the conversation was about, she would suddenly appear beside me and insert herself, always with an air of innocent enthusiasm, like she had just happened to overhear something interesting. It didn't matter if I was catching up one-on-one with my dad in the kitchen, helping my mom with the dishes while reminiscing about something personal, or laughing with Zach about an old childhood story. There she was, always leaning in, always steering the subject toward something she could comment on. At first, I tried to be patient. I told myself she was probably just trying to feel included, that maybe it was her way of connecting with me, of fitting into the family dynamics where bonds had already been forged long before she arrived. I smiled through the interruptions, let her chime in even when I felt the conversation pulling off course, and gave her the benefit of the doubt. After all, she didn't have family of her own. Maybe she just didn't know how to navigate these moments. But the longer it went on, the more it started to feel like she wasn't just trying to be part of things. It felt like she was trying to wedge herself into every space I occupied, like she needed to be seen anytime I was seen. And I didn't know what to make of that yet, but I knew I was starting to feel crowded in my own home. When Zach and Kelly announced their engagement, it should have been a joyful moment, something purely celebratory and uncomplicated, but for me it came at a time when my heart was already divided. That same evening, I received a call that Mrs. Grace had fallen and broken her hip, and I knew immediately I had to leave. There wasn't even a question in my mind. She was more than just someone I worked for. She was family, and I couldn't imagine not being there for her. I explained to my parents what had happened, and just as I was gathering my things, Zach quietly asked me to step into one of the side rooms. He looked so excited, like he could barely contain it, and I could tell he wanted to make sure I heard it from him directly before the official announcement. He told me he had proposed and that Kelly had said yes, and then he pulled me into a hug that reminded me of when we were kids and used to sneak downstairs after bedtime just to talk. It was a beautiful, quiet moment between siblings, the kind I'll always remember. But before I could even let it settle in, before I could say much more than how happy I was for him, Kelly appeared in the doorway. Her voice, light but with a sharp edge to it, cut straight through the mood. She said, "It's kind of inappropriate, don't you think? The first child in the family leaving before the big announcement." She laughed like it was a joke, but it didn't land like one. I turned to her, stunned, caught off guard by the passive aggression wrapped in a smile, and I could feel the joy of that private moment with my brother dim instantly. Zach looked just as surprised, and though he didn't say anything right away, I could feel the tension rise between all three of us. I said goodbye as politely as I could, but the words felt tight in my throat. I left the house with a strange mix of guilt, worry, and irritation swirling in my chest, not just because I had to leave, but because something in Kelly's tone made it clear that in her mind, my absence wasn't just inconvenient, it was unacceptable. And that stung more than I expected. After months of battling complications from her fall and the slow decline that followed, Mrs. Grace passed away quietly in her sleep, and even though I had been preparing myself for the inevitability of it, the loss hit me harder than I could have imagined. It felt like a piece of my world had gone still, like a door had quietly shut on a chapter that had shaped me in ways I was only just beginning to understand. She had been more than my employer. She had been a mentor, a protector, and in the absence of my own grandparents, a kind of anchor in my adult life. Her great-granddaughter, who had become a friend through all the care transitions and family coordination, reached out a few days later and invited me to accompany her to the family cottage to scatter Mrs. Grace's ashes, just as she had requested in her will. It felt like a final act of love, something sacred and important, and I agreed without hesitation. When I told my family about the trip, which was planned for the middle of the week and only a few days before Zach and Kelly's wedding, my mother immediately said she wanted to come with us. She had met Mrs. Grace once and had always respected the bond we had, and I think she knew that being there, even quietly in the background, would be a way to support me during a moment of heavy grief. But as soon as the words were out of her mouth, Kelly snapped. She was furious, not quietly disappointed or gently concerned, but visibly angry in a way that made everyone fall silent. She said it was thoughtless to plan something so dramatic just 2 days before the wedding, that it would take the attention away from the lead up to her big day. I remember just standing there, stunned, the weight of my grief still fresh and raw while she spoke as if Mrs. Grace's death was some kind of inconvenience. She didn't ask how I was holding up or what Mrs. Grace had meant to me. She didn't even pause to acknowledge the loss. All she saw was the proximity to her wedding date, and in her mind that was all that mattered. My mom said nothing in that moment, but I could feel the tension in her posture as she slowly crossed her arms and looked away. It was the first time I truly realized that Kelly didn't just misunderstand me, she didn't care to understand at all. When Kelly said it, she didn't whisper it or try to disguise it behind a brittle smile. She just looked at me, arms folded, and said with this sharp, cold certainty that I cared more about a dead woman who wasn't even related to me than I did about my so-called future family. I felt my breath catch in my chest, not from shock exactly but from the sheer cruelty of it. The way she dismissed Mrs. Grace's life, her importance to me, the grief I was still very much carrying, like it was some sentimental distraction that should have been put away quietly so we could all get back to fawning over her wedding plans. It wasn't just insensitive, it was deliberate. A line drawn in the sand. And something in me snapped. I didn't raise my voice or cry or ask her to take it back. I just looked her in the eye and told her plainly that I didn't even consider her a friend. That if it weren't for Zach, I wouldn't have tried to get along with her at all. And that was the honest truth. Every effort I'd made to be civil, to engage with her at family gatherings, to include her in conversations, to smile when I wanted to walk away, it had all been for my brother. Because I love him. Because I wanted to believe that someone he loved couldn't possibly be as self-centered and mean-spirited as she kept proving herself to be. But that moment, when she reduced my grief to a form of disloyalty, was the moment I stopped pretending. The words hung between us for a second too long, and I could see the flicker of something behind her eyes. Not sadness or guilt, but a flash of offense, like she couldn't believe someone would actually say that to her out loud. She turned on her heel and walked out of the room without another word, leaving me standing there, still angry but strangely relieved. Because for the first time since she entered our lives, I had finally said what I really felt. And it felt like reclaiming something I hadn't realized I'd been slowly giving up: my own voice. After our confrontation, I tried to collect myself in the kitchen, telling myself to stay calm, to stay grounded, but only minutes later Kelly came in after me, her face already streaked with tears. Her voice was trembling as she said she didn't understand why I hated her so much, that all she ever wanted was to be part of my family, that she had been trying so hard because she looked up to me and wanted us to be close. She said it like a confession, like she believed the weight of her crying would soften everything she'd just done. But even as she stood there, crying and looking vulnerable, all she talked about was the wedding, how hard she'd worked on it, how stressed she was, how painful it was that I wouldn't just focus on her joy instead of a woman who had passed away and wasn't even, in her words, technically part of our family. And that was when I felt something in me start to shut down, not out of anger but out of sheer exhaustion. Not once, through any of it, had she offered a single condolence, not even a simple, "I'm sorry," for the death of a woman who had been like a grandmother to me. Her tears, her plea for connection, it all rang hollow because it wasn't about grief or reconciliation, it was about her. Her wedding. Her moment. Her feelings. I looked at her, standing there with red-rimmed eyes, and all I could feel was this overwhelming wave of disappointment, this ache in my chest that whispered, "You don't get to cry about being left out when you never once tried to see the pain in someone else." So I didn't say anything. I didn't offer comfort. I just quietly grabbed my bag, walked out the front door and left. I didn't slam it, didn't make a scene. I just couldn't stay there anymore. Not with someone who wanted my loyalty but couldn't give me even the smallest thread of empathy in return. Later that week, still heavy from everything that had been said and unsaid, I sat down with my parents, needing to know if it was just me, if I had been overreacting, too sensitive, too wrapped up in grief to see things clearly. But as soon as I brought up Kelly's behavior, my mom and dad exchanged a look that made my stomach turn, that silent glance people share when there's something they've been holding back but know they can't anymore. They admitted, gently but without much hesitation, that they'd noticed a lot of the same things. My mom said Kelly had been making inappropriate comments for months, little digs slipped into conversations that always walked the line between joking and cruel. She told me how Kelly liked to call herself their real daughter, sometimes in front of guests, always with a smirk like she thought it was cute, like she was trying to stake her claim not just in the family but in the space I'd occupied all my life. My dad added that she would constantly compare our gifts, asking who got the more expensive present, whose card had more sentiment, which photos were displayed more prominently in the house. It made them uncomfortable, but they hadn't wanted to stir up tension before the wedding. I sat there listening, a quiet fury building under my skin, especially when my mom finally told me that Kelly had laughed, actually laughed, while telling someone I had cried more for Mrs. Grace than I had when my grandfather died. That comment landed like a slap. Mrs. Grace had been in my life daily for years. She'd helped me through school, held my hand through some of the darkest moments in my life, and celebrated every single success with me. Of course I cried. Of course I grieved. But the fact that Kelly could turn even that into something to mock, to diminish, was beyond cruel, it was calculated. Hearing all of this didn't shock me as much as it solidified something I had been trying to ignore for too long. I wasn't crazy and I wasn't alone. My instincts had been right all along. Something in Kelly's kindness had always been performative, transactional, wrapped in layers of insecurity and control. And now that it had all unraveled, I was no longer interested in stitching it back together. When Zach finally came to talk to me, it was quiet and without the usual awkward tension he carried when trying to defend someone he loved. He sat down across from me, his hands loosely clasped like he wasn't sure where to begin, and then he just said he was sorry. Not in passing, not as a formality, but with a weight I could feel sink into the room. He apologized for everything, for not seeing it sooner, for letting things build to this point, for not stepping in when he should have. He told me that over the past few weeks, especially since the outburst about Mrs. Grace, things had started to click in ways he couldn't ignore anymore. He admitted that Kelly had been saying things about me, things that weren't just petty or competitive, but mean, intentionally cutting, and that even though he hadn't fully understood them at the time, they had started to feel wrong. What really caught me off guard was when he told me that Kelly had said hurtful things about Mrs. Grace too, even though she had never met her. He said there were times when I would mention her or share a small story, and Kelly would roll her eyes or make jokes under her breath about how dramatic I was being, or how weird it was to be so attached to some old woman. Zach said he always brushed it off in the moment, thinking it was just her awkward way of processing things, but now, looking back, he knew that wasn't it. It was cruel. And he had let it go on far too long. Then he said something that both softened and broke my heart. He told me that her behavior had been a burden to him too, that he had felt it pressing on him, confusing and heavy for months. That trying to manage her moods, her insecurities, her endless need for validation had been exhausting. But he hadn't spoken up because, in his words, she's never had a real family, and I thought if I just gave her that, maybe she'd stop needing to tear other people down. He had been trying to rescue her with love, trying to fix a hole that wasn't his responsibility to fill. And in doing so he had hurt me and maybe even himself. We sat in silence for a moment, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like I had to defend my grief or explain my anger. Zach saw it. He understood. And while nothing about his apology could undo what had already happened, it meant something to hear him finally say the truth out loud, that I hadn't imagined any of it, and that none of it was okay. After that long and painful conversation with Zach, it became clear to both of us that something had to change. We couldn't keep pretending that things would get better on their own or that Kelly's behavior was just a phase she would grow out of once she felt more secure. We had both spent too much time making excuses for her, brushing aside red flags, and hoping that kindness and patience alone would be enough to shift something in her. But it hadn't. And by staying quiet, we were only making it easier for her to continue crossing lines that should have never been tested in the first place. So together we made the decision to set clear, unshakable boundaries, not out of anger but out of self-respect and necessity. Zach looked so tired when he agreed, like the weight of months had finally settled fully on his shoulders, and now that he was no longer denying it, he could finally feel how heavy it had become. There was a deep sadness in his face, not just for the difficult conversations ahead, but for the dream he had once clung to, that he could somehow build a happy, seamless life with someone who was quietly unraveling the very fabric of what it meant to be a family. It hurt to see him like that, to watch the person I loved most in this world wrestle with disappointment and guilt, but as much as I wanted to shield him from it, I couldn't lie to make things easier. It hurt me even more to be silent, to keep swallowing my own discomfort just to maintain the illusion of peace. We talked late into the night, going over what we would and wouldn't tolerate anymore. No more veiled insults, no more dismissing grief, no more inserting herself into every private moment with entitlement and jealousy. If she wanted to be part of the family, truly part of it, then she would need to learn how to be kind without control, present without manipulation. For the first time in a long while, I felt a flicker of something that almost resembled hope. Not because I believed Kelly would change, but because I knew we finally had the strength to stop shrinking ourselves just to make her comfortable. In the end, I chose to go to Mrs. Grace's funeral instead of the wedding. It wasn't a dramatic decision, not some grand act of defiance. It was simply where my heart needed to be. That cottage, the quiet place where we were to scatter her ashes, held more truth and love for me than any ballroom ever could. I had to honor the woman who helped shape me into who I am, who stood by me when I was still figuring out how to stand by myself. And as I packed my bag and prepared to leave, my father came to me quietly, saying he wouldn't be going to the wedding either. He didn't make a speech or explain himself with flowery words. He just said that some things matter more than appearances, and if people can't understand that, they were never going to understand his love for his daughter. Zach didn't try to talk me out of it. We'd said all there was to say. He looked pained when I told him, but he nodded, like part of him already knew this was coming. The wedding happened without us, and from what I heard later, it was beautiful in the way that photographs capture but memories can't always hold. But Zach stood there, alone with Kelly, without his sister and without his father, and I think a part of him felt the weight of that emptiness even beneath the vows and the flowers and the cake. Since that day, things between him and the family have changed. He hardly speaks to any of us now except for our mom, who keeps trying to be the bridge, the one thread connecting all the frayed ends. It breaks my heart in quiet ways. To lose a grandmother figure and, at the same time, watch my brother slip further away from the people who've loved him his whole life feels like grief stacked upon grief. But I couldn't betray myself by showing up to something that had been built on the foundation of my silence. I chose the goodbye that mattered most to me, and even if it cost me more than I expected, I still believe I made the right choice. Because sometimes love looks like presence, and sometimes it looks like walking away from a room that was never safe to enter. Not long after the wedding, during one of the rare times Zach and I actually spoke alone, just a quick, tense phone call that felt more fragile than it should have, he confessed something that had clearly been weighing on him. He said that one of the biggest problems between Kelly and him, even from early on, was her jealousy toward me. At first, I didn't know how to react. Confused, maybe even a little amused at the thought that anything about our sibling relationship could be threatening to someone. But Zach didn't laugh when he said it. His voice was low and tired, and I could hear the strain behind every word. He told me that Kelly never liked the closeness we had, even when it was something as simple and innocent as the two of us lying on the couch together, playing games or watching movies, things we had done since we were kids, long before she ever entered the picture. He said those moments, which to us were filled with comfort and familiarity, triggered something in her that he didn't understand at first. She would get distant, cold, or lash out afterward, making passive-aggressive remarks or sulking in silence for hours. At one point, she even accused him of emotionally favoring me, like I was some kind of competition instead of his sister. He told me he tried to reassure her, to explain that our bond was just a part of who he was, that it didn't take anything away from what they were building together. But no matter how many times he tried, the jealousy stayed. It lingered under the surface of every family gathering, every casual sibling moment, every memory that didn't include her. Listening to him admit all of this, I felt a strange mix of sadness and guilt. Sadness that something so pure could be twisted into something threatening, and guilt that I had unknowingly become a source of tension in his relationship. But more than anything, I felt frustrated for him. He was stuck in a situation where love had turned into control, and comfort had been mistaken for rivalry. And as much as he tried to carry it all quietly, I could hear in his voice that it was eating away at him. The closeness we once had, the kind of bond that had always felt unshakable, now felt like something he had to apologize for, and that hurt more than I could admit. When Zach and I spoke again, there was this moment, long and hesitant, where he tried to explain what had been going on from Kelly's perspective, almost like he was still holding out hope that if I could just understand her better, maybe all of this wouldn't feel so broken. He told me that Kelly had wanted to get close to me, that she genuinely did, but that she didn't know how to talk to me. He said it like an excuse, but also like a quiet confession, as if he was finally admitting something he had tried to rationalize for far too long. I remember sitting there, holding the phone against my ear, wondering how it could be that someone who had managed to charm our entire extended family had somehow never figured out how to hold a normal, respectful conversation with me. And the truth was, I had tried. I really had. There was a time when I decided maybe I'd been too guarded, too suspicious, and I owed it to Zach to at least give her the benefit of a clean slate. So I invited her out for coffee, just the two of us, somewhere neutral and quiet. I asked her about her work, her hobbies, her past, trying to open space for connection. But every time I said something that hinted at emotion or shared something personal, she either deflected or twisted it back on herself in a way that felt more like performance than vulnerability. The tension kept rising in ways I couldn't control, and eventually, it all boiled over. I don't even remember exactly what started it. Maybe something I said about boundaries, or maybe it was her comment about me thinking I'm better than everyone else. Whatever it was, the conversation collapsed into a fight that left both of us raw and bitter. After that, I stopped trying. And as much as Zach wanted to believe that her awkwardness was the only reason things had gone wrong, I knew better. It wasn't just that she didn't know how to talk to me, it was that she didn't want to listen. Every attempt she made at closeness felt like a demand to be accepted without ever being accountable, like I owed her intimacy simply because she'd married my brother. But relationships, real ones, don't work that way. And no matter how much Zach tried to paint it in softer colors, the damage was already done. Since the day of their wedding, I haven't seen Kelly or Zach, not once. They've slowly and quietly drifted away from all of us, like a boat unmoored, slipping out of reach without any real goodbye. There were no dramatic fallouts or confrontations after that, no slamming doors or screaming matches, just a steady, painful silence that settled over everything. My mom still talks to them occasionally, mostly through text or brief phone calls that never go deeper than surface-level check-ins, but even she has drawn her own line. She told me one day with a kind of tired finality that she won't let Kelly in the house anymore. Not because she's angry, but because she can no longer pretend that Kelly's presence doesn't change the air in the room. We all tried to welcome her, to offer space and kindness and chances, but every effort we made was met with resistance or manipulation or thinly veiled contempt. There's only so much reaching out a person can do before they realize they're stretching themselves to the point of breaking. And in the end, our boundaries, the ones we set out of respect for ourselves and each other, never seemed to matter to her. They were treated like inconveniences to be pushed past, like lines drawn in sand that she could casually step over if it served her purpose. What hurts the most, I think, is losing Zach in the process, not because of one single choice but because of a slow, steady erosion of trust and connection. He chose silence. He chose distance. And while I still hold space for the version of him that used to laugh beside me on the couch, I've come to accept that sometimes the people we love choose paths that we simply can't follow. Now, I live in Mrs. Grace's house. It's quiet here in a way that feels gentle rather than lonely, like the kind of quiet that lets your thoughts breathe. The walls still carry the warmth of her framed photos, her favorite teacup still on the shelf, the creak in the floor near the hallway she used to scold me for stepping too heavily on. I've kept things mostly the same, not out of sentimentality but because it feels right, like she's still here in small ways, reminding me to keep going, to hold on to the parts of myself that are steady and kind. I'm finishing my studies now, something she always believed in more fiercely than I ever did. And each time I open my textbooks, I remember that her belief in me wasn't just generosity, it was trust. I miss her every day. Sometimes it's sharp, like an ache that rises out of nowhere when I pass her bedroom door or when a certain piece of music plays. Other times it's soft, a quiet longing folded into my daily rhythm. But with that loss has also come a kind of peace I didn't expect. Peace in knowing that I stayed true to myself even when it meant stepping away. Peace in knowing that I didn't pretend for comfort, that I didn't trade self-respect for harmony. I tried. I opened my heart. I gave people more chances than they deserved. And when they showed me who they were, I listened. What happened with Zach and Kelly, what we lost as a family, still stings. But I've stopped picking at that wound, stopped asking what I could have done differently. Some things are simply not meant to be held onto, no matter how much we love the person tied to them. And now, in this house filled with echoes of love and loss, I can finally be honest with myself. I did my best. The rest, where it goes, how it ends, is no longer mine to carry.